בוקר טוב לכולם. תודה למי שהצטרף ביום מאתגר כזה. שמי עברי ורבין, מנכ"ל גוד ויז'ן, יועצים לאחריות תאגידית מגרנד תורונטון. יש לנו הרבה מאוד משתתפים, ולשמחתי גם הרבה מאוד משתתפים מהעולם, אז ברשותכם אנחנו נעבור לאנגלית. זה גם נושא ככה גלובלי, וכל התקנים האלה הם בינלאומיים בהגדרה, אז ברשותכם נדבר גם באנגלית. So good morning, everybody. I'm very happy to be with you and thank you for the participation. We'll speak today about, we call it the next big thing in ESG, which is the TCFD. We'll speak about the climate risk, but more and more about how to implement TCFD. As we always believe in practical tips, we have a target today is that at least you will not be afraid from using the TCFD. We know that you have too many synonyms and too many models and frameworks in ESG, but we really understand this is the next big thing. Next slide, please. So we'll, after a short introduction, we'll take it from the macro to the micro to the micro, from the climate risk to the disclosing process, to the TCFD and how to do it in practice. And then should we have time, we'll have a Q&A from you. Alternatively, and meanwhile, you can use the chat in order to ask some questions. Next slide, please. Just to those of you who don't really know us yet, Good Vision Grant Thornton is an ESG consulting firm. We work locally and internationally. We are have 15 or 16 consultants on environment, on ethics, reporting, assurance, and we try to be a one-stop shop. We are try to be to bring to our clients the variety of know-how and network from around the world, and therefore we are actively participate in most of the ESG organization and in the standards. Next slide, please. So when we speak about TCFD, we cannot ignore the context, the wider context that there is more and more emphasis on the climate risk outside of the TCFD, and the TCFD is interlinked in many of the relevant frameworks such as the CDP and GRI and SBT, which I'm sure most of you know about it, but we want to focus today on the TCFD. Just take into consideration that it's in many ways interlinked. It's also interlinked with regulation. Locally with the Bank of Israel, which is one of our clients, there is a lot of requests from disclosure on climate risk. And if you talk globally, we speak about the SEC and just last month or 2 months ago, the administration under Biden moved forward and start to close the gap on climate disclosure from the private sector's company. Only last week, the ISSB released the end in a consultation process about a new climate-specific standard that it will be valid as of January 24, and it's indicated in the standard that those of you who are reporting and using the TCFD can use it in the new standards. So before we jump into the discussion, let us ask you one question. Leah, please put the poll so we can have a baseline of what you know about the issue. So we'll have you like 1 minute just to answer a very simple question. Okay, you can show us the results, hopefully. Let me say that I'm not surprised that 90% of the people are not familiar or partly familiar with the TCFD, which also indicate why this webinar was very popular, and we have more than 100 people who sign in. Thank you, Leah. And next slide, please. Okay, before we move on, I'm really happy and privileged to ask our colleague from Ma'ala, the Israeli ESG leading organization, Anat Musenko, who is running the network and the environmental and sustainability branch of Ma'ala. Good morning, Anat.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Ivry, and everyone. On behalf of Ma'ala, I'd just like to say that we are happy to be part of this meetup and hope to see a broader adoption of the TCFD framework among companies in Israel. Climate-related disclosure is a very important topic, and we are also integrating it in our work via our annual ESG index. Just a quick word on that. The Ma'ala ESG index is a local index rating companies in Israel according to their ESG performance. The index is based on a very elaborate questionnaire covering many topics in ESG. And in fact, the largest chapter in this questionnaire is the environmental one, which also includes climate-related disclosure. Participating in the index is voluntary, meaning that companies rated on the index choose to voluntarily disclose the information according to the questionnaire. The index, which follows and adheres to global ESG standards and frameworks, is widely viewed as the standard of ESG disclosure and expectations in Israel. Thanks, Ivry and Good Vision team for organizing this meetup, and thank you all for taking the time and joining.
Thank you, Anat. Like always, a pleasure to cooperate with you. Next slide, please. Okay, so I ask in order to execute the discussion, I asked two of our environmental consultants to lead you through the discussion. We have Alex Segal, who is our TCFD analyst, had many years of working in Europe on TCFD projects in real estate and other sectors, and Tevel Dekel, who will give you the wider perspective. He's the head of our environmental department. Next slide, please. So Tevel, the floor is yours. Good luck.
Thank you, Ivry and Anat, for the opening. So it's really nice to see that we have so many participants from Israel and from all over the world in our webinar. So I'm Tevel Dekel. I'm from the environmental department of Good Vision. And we have many services. We have carbon footprint calculation, carbon reduction plans, climate change strategies. We're doing a lot of things. And today we would like to focus on climate risks and the TCFD framework. Next slide, please. So we will start with what is climate risk and how it is related to my company's finance. Next slide, please. So the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, defines climate risk as the potential for adverse consequences for human or ecological systems. We know that those risks can arise from potential impacts of climate change. So in our context of this webinar, we will focus on the economic risks along with risks on your assets and on your investment. Next slide, please. So the TCFD split climate risk into two categories. First, we have physical risks. Physical risks, which are the acute and chronic ones, such as extreme weather events like wildfire and floods. Additionally, changing weather patterns such as the rising of average temperature and sea level are considered as physical risks. Among the second category, which is the transition risk, are the risks for your business that can refer as policy and legal risks, like a future change in the regulation, technology risks, market risks, such as the rising cost of raw materials, and of course, reputation risks. Next slide, please. So closer to home, here we have two examples of Israel experiencing physical risks. We have the wildfires in Jerusalem, as well the flooding in the north, in the city of Nahariya. We intend to consider those events as one-off. However, those situations, frequency and magnitude will increase in the future according to scientists. Next slide, please. So the TCFD is not here to tell you that your company will only face climate risk. There are many opportunities that can arise out of being prepared for climate change, like new investment opportunities can get you into green markets or to make you a pioneer in your sector, along with greater efficiency according to your resource efficiency that can help you to decrease your cost. And of course, one of the most obvious opportunities is greater resilience of your company for the future. Next slide, please. As we can see in those headlines in this slide, this is just a small sample of reporting on the financial impacts of climate change from the last couple of years. The cost for companies is estimated in billions and trillions of dollars. Note that those estimations were conducted in the previous year, and if companies will not align with efforts on their side against climate change, those numbers will be significantly higher in the future. Next slide, please. So after I talked about what are climate risks, we have as well the physical and the transition risks, and to see the climate change as an opportunity. So why should I disclose? Why my company should disclose what they are doing in the on the side of climate risk? Next slide, please. So what benefits can you obtain through disclosure? According to surveys that were conducted among companies that disclose according to the framework of TCFD, there are many reasons and benefits for disclosing. First, as part of your risk management, you are able to identify potential climate-related risks and also opportunities. Additionally, disclosing increasing the transparency of your business for your stakeholders, such as clients and employees. Following up with, of course, satisfying your investor demands and the readiness of your business for potential financial impact by climate change. Another benefit, of course, it's the readiness for expected future regulation, which I elaborate a bit more in the next slide. So next slide, please. So now, are you on paper legally required to disclosure, or will you be required in the future? This image on your left shows countries where TCFD is currently being required. We have the UK, we have Canada, we have Hong Kong, for example. Just this year in the States, the SEC introduced a new regulation which aligns strongly with the TCFD and relates to companies who are both domestic and foreign that are traded in the US. Companies will be required to disclose their climate-related risks and how they manage those risks as part of their risk management. Just over here in Israel, recently, the supervisor of the banks in the Federal Bank of Israel recommended commercial banks to disclose their climate-related risks. From our experience, from what we see here in Israel and around the world, what is being recommended today will become mandatory in the future. And furthermore, if your country is not on the list currently, it is likely that within the next 3 to 5 years, it will be mandatory for you to disclose. So it's better to be ready today for your future expected regulation. Next slide, please. So now I will give the floor to my colleague, Alexandra Segal.
Great, thank you, Tevel. So now we'll be taking you through exactly what TCFD is and why you're in this webinar today, which is ultimately to learn how you can maximize it to your benefit. Next slide. So let's start with the basics. So the who, what, where, and when. The who. So the TCFD task force consists of 31 members, and these members are from across the G20, and they represent both preparers and users of financial disclosures. The task force is chaired by Michael Bloomberg. So those of you who undergo ESG reporting will be familiar with him as part of the Bloomberg ratings. And those of you who don't may be more familiar with him as the ex-mayor of New York. And now on to the what. So TCFD is unusual because it takes a slightly different approach versus traditional ESG. TCFD looks at managing climate-related impacts on the business rather than mitigating the climate change itself. And it is very much a response to the climate crisis, not a preventative measure. Interestingly, it uses forward-looking rather than historical data, and one of the key points within the recommendations is that companies need to define their time horizons, and these are against short, medium, and long-term time horizons. So let's move on to the where. So everywhere in blue is a country where companies are currently disclosing against the recommendations. And as Tevel mentioned earlier, this is slightly different to regulations. And in total, we're seeing around 89 countries where disclosures are taking place. So the when. The Financial Stability Board was established around 2015. And this was then followed up by the recommendations in 2017. And if you are familiar at all with TCFD, it's likely it's this document that you know. And then since then, and more recently since 2020, there has been more guidance, including sector-specific guidance that's been released. So if you look at exactly who is disclosing, I hope that we can all see some household names up there. We have HSBC, Nestle, Unilever, as well as from the real estate sector, we have names including British Land and BlackRock. Interestingly, from our previous experience working with the framework, we work with a range of clients from different backgrounds, which is great because TCFD is meant for all sectors. How each sector will apply the recommendations will differ. And even within a sector, so we take real estate, even within real estate, for example, British Land as a property developer and BlackRock as an investment manager will use the same set of recommendations, but they will use them in a slightly different way, which leads to a varied climate strategy. And as you can see on the chart on your right, the number of supporters has exponentially increased to over 3,000 in 2022. So how exactly is TCFD structured? The 11 recommendations we mentioned earlier are then further split into 4 sections. Start zoomed out, let's start with governance. We look at governance structure around climate risk and opportunities. The next layer is strategy, where we look at how we're accounting for climate change within your financial and long-term corporate strategy. Next, risk management. This is arguably the most important and challenging section, where we look at what processes of risk identification and management are in place. We want to look at how we can assess and manage climate risk. And then finally, the last section is metrics and targets. Here we begin to quantify climate risk to allow us to measure progress over time. So how does a typical TCFD report look like and how can it be structured? So there are different ways to do this. Some companies prefer a standalone TCFD report, which sits separate from your annual financial filings, your annual report, and your ESG report, whilst others prefer to integrate TCFD into an existing ESG report. So from our previous experience, the biggest determinant of how far of where this disclosure takes place tends to depend on how far aligned and comprehensive the disclosure is. So as you can see on your screen, this is an example from HSBC, who are an international bank, and this is their standalone, completely independent TCFD report. And on your screen now, there is a risk management cutout. And as we can see, risks have been split into two main sections, as Tevil mentioned earlier, of physical risk and transition risk. And these are then mapped against financial and non-financial risks as detailed within the framework. These risks are then assessed in terms of their magnitude and significance, and how they are managed is then disclosed within the report. Right. And now we have a cutout from the metrics and targets section. And we can see on this page how the metrics go beyond what we typically perceive as coming under climate risk. It's not all flooding and hurricanes. In fact, it can also be supporting your supply chain through sustainable finance funding. So now we can look at an integrated report. This is a combined ESG report for GRI, SASB, and TCFD for a multinational company. The report, as you can see, is still broken down into these 4 overarching sections, but it also identifies where a crossover exists, such as with a CDP disclosure. This report style is more suited to companies who, after undergoing a gap analysis, have some progress to make before fully complying. Next slide, please. Again, for those familiar with TCFD, this will be a familiar image, but if you're not, we'll take you through it, don't worry. So these are the 11 recommendations within the 4 headings. And in purple, we have pulled out a couple of the main ones, which are worth going over in a bit more detail. So we'll start with strategy, which, as we mentioned earlier, can be one of the more challenging sections. And under this, there is a recommendation to conduct a scenario analysis. And this is definitely one of the more technical recommendations and can benefit from the use of a third-party software, such as physical risk and transition risk providers. Ultimately, scenario analysis allows a company to understand and quantify your climate risk and any uncertainties your company may face. And it does this under different hypothetical futures based on temperature and transition alignment. From our experience, we would recommend scenario analysis for those further into your TCFD journey. If you are just beginning or you're just starting the process, it is more impactful to focus on the education element and board oversight of climate, along with seeing how the existing risk management is taking place before we do this deep dive into scenario analysis and future scenarios. Next slide, please. So now we have metrics and targets. This is the last section of the framework and can be another challenging one to comply with. So under metrics and targets, we have a reference to net zero carbon. And net zero carbon, as Tevil mentioned earlier, is a transition risk, and it's also a key part of TCFD. From our previous project experience, it's likely that clients who are already disclosing their emissions, either as part of a standalone transition plan or ESG strategy, will find this recommendation easier to disclose. However, what can be more challenging is when you're required to set wider climate targets, and these can include salaries of board members set against climate objectives, or for asset managers specifically, a disclosure is required to say how many assets under management and their investment strategies comply with a 2-degree warming scenario. Next slide. So now we'll go through how TCFD works in practice. So what we want to stress as part of today is that TCFD is a process. It's not just a destination. Ultimately, it is a set of recommendations to be worked through, and it does follow a set structure. It is not recommended to start at stage 8 here, reporting and disclosure. Instead, TCFD is designed to be educational and transformative for the whole company. It's key to start by understanding what climate risk means to your organization. Then we can move into setting your climate ambition and into the strategy phase. And it's here when we would start to introduce any metrics and targets and then begin scenario analysis at a later stage. Before then, we would think about what a transition plan would look like. How are you setting your net zero carbon goals? And if you're aligning to a science-based target under 1.5 degree or 2-degree target, before disclosure would then take place. From our experience, a strong TCFD disclosure is not a rushed one. A common pitfall that we see clients make is to disclose before doing a thorough gap analysis and roadmap, which can lead to a weaker disclosure and also reputational risks. So we want to stress, TCFD is a process, not just a report. And next slide, please. So what does it actually look like to go through a TCFD process? We like to start, as we're doing with this webinar, at the beginning, with the client upskilling and education. We want to give you the skills to be able to identify climate risks and opportunities within your own organization. The next stage moves deeper into the analysis stage. Here, the resilience strategy is defined and the climate ambition set. A gap analysis against your current level and disclosure against TCFD is also established. Then, as the final stage, here is when we move into reporting and disclosure. We set metrics and targets and move into publishing your report outlining your progress. It's also interesting to go through some common challenges and experiences that we have worked through as part of working with the framework. So when working with clients, it's key to ensure the board and executive leadership team are engaged as early as possible in the process, especially within phase 1. TCFD focuses on the management of climate risk, and the management and decision-making often comes from the top. Climate risk, especially for those within the real estate sector, needs to be integrated all along all parts of your business model or asset lifecycle. So this includes from acquisitions to disposal. As soon as you invest in an asset, you take on its associated climate risk. So we need to be asking ourselves, how are we screening our assets for their physical and transition risks before we make our investments? Ultimately, as we move into stage 2, we need a joined-up approach. If one of your funds or products is marketed and operates as a sustainable or green fund or product, what lessons can we take from that product or fund, and how can we apply this to the rest of the business? Finally, if you do find yourself closer to stage 2 and 3, and you are looking at disclosing and scenario analysis, don't be spooked by scenario analysis. The majority of companies who have disclosed have identified scenario analysis as one of the more challenging recommendations. We recommend thoroughly looking into what scenarios you want to use, and the scenarios will be different based upon your industry, location, and strategy. For example, as an energy company, scenario analysis you could use is from the International Energy Agency. No matter where you are in terms of your alignment maturity, Good Vision has the experience and knowledge to guide you through step by step. So what are some takeaways based on our previous experience? First of all, don't panic. Chances are, if you're already disclosing or aligning to existing sustainability standards or frameworks, such as SASB, CDP, GRI, PRI, or a number of others, you're on the right path. But it's important not to run before we learn how to walk. If you're at the beginning of your TCFD journey, we really recommend starting by assessing where you currently stand against a disclosure, rather than disclosing right away. The TCFD disclosure report should not only identify what is being done currently, but will show what needs to be done. We also have numerous examples where clients dive in straight away and focus on the all sector guidance rather than any sector specific guidance. The TCFD has been very clear that these two documents need to be considered together. And let's not focus on the risks, but also the opportunities. As Tevil mentioned earlier, TCFD encourages companies to look at opportunities that can arise from a changing climate. Green tech, despite world economic troubles, was one of the fastest growing markets. How can we move into these new markets and incorporate market efficiencies into our business model? And finally, let's look to the future. We need to define our long-term strategy for managing climate risk, and let's not just focus on historical data. Great, so I think that we'll hand over back to Ivry now for the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you, Alex, for the enlightening presentation. Indeed, we just wanted to upgrade your curiosity and to start a discussion that can be a follow-up later. Somebody asked me during the meeting, I don't know why you use WhatsApp and not Q&A, but the cost. So, of course, it's connected to the characteristics of the company, etc. But I have a very good news. Good Vision Grant Thornton has an agreement with the Ministry of Economy, and to those companies that are from the industry sector, you can get a 50 to up to 70% a sponsorship by the Ministry of Economy through the center for named Yael, which is like how to create a better circular economy and reducing emission. So those of you who are interested can call us later. Tevel, do we have other questions from the participants before we move on?
Yeah, we have a participant that asked about how long does it take the process of the TCFD. Maybe Alex can answer about that.
So for TCFD, as we showed on the previous slides, we like to break it down into these three main sections. The overall process can take at least 3 to 4 months, at least for the first 2 stages, and then the disclosure will follow. It really does depend on your company's current status, which we establish during the gap analysis, but to be safe, we like to say at least 3 to 4 months. And the process can be integrated with any existing ESG reporting process.
Thank you. Another thing that we want to share with you, and Tevel, take a look meanwhile on the other questions and put the slides for the COP28, please. Next month, after a few years of experience in participating in the COP conferences in Glasgow, in Sharm el-Sheikh, in Egypt, next one in November will take place in the United Arab Emirates. And we invited one of the organizers of the private sector platform there called Innovation Zone. And he can meet face-to-face in person companies who are interested to participate in an active way in the Arab Emirates conference in November. Okay, Tevel, more questions from the audience?
We have a question about if there's like any sectors that is like more relevant for them to disclose according to the TCFD, or that it's like relevant for like that sectors or not another. Maybe that Alex can answer as well.
So all organizations globally can disclose under the TCFD recommendations. The recommendations are meant for all sectors. However, the recommendations are particularly encouraged from those with public debt and equity, as well as asset managers and owners. There has also been some specific guidance, which we mentioned earlier. This is supplemental guidance released since 2020, supporting the recommendations. And these are for groups within the financial sector and non-financial groups. And the sectors are between energy, transportation, materials and building, and agriculture, food and forest products. This is not an exclusive list, but if your company does tend to be within these groups, we do recommend disclosing.
And we have another question from a company that they said that they are already reporting according to GRI and SASB. So they ask why to have this framework. So as Alex said, this is more a future looking than just on your previous ESG performance. And as well, you can integrate it, as Alex showed in your report of your sustainability ESG report, and to have your TCFD disclosure. If you are in your first step, you can integrate it in your sustainability report along with your GRI and SASB requirements. And further in your journey, you will be able to have a full TCFD disclosure report just for this framework. Yeah. If I have another question. I think those are the questions that we have so far.
Okay.
Maybe do you want to emphasize to enlight something else?
Again, I just want to say thank you for the participants, and we really welcome people from the UK, from Malta, from Greece, Slovenia, Netherlands, Emirates, Cyprus, Sweden, India, Ireland, and Australia. Different time zones, and the companies that participate as well from most of the sectors. Those of you who really wanted to dive in and to deep for the practicalities and follow-up, you have our email or phone number, and we'll be more really happy to support you in your journey toward implementing the TCFD and the other climate risk issues. Thank you again, and have a good and safe day.